I'm going to take you a little bit through history pages so we'll understand a little bit how the Jewish community operates in Ukraine, why there is different complexities in the Jewish community, and how I became not affiliated with my Jewish background, etc., and didn't know that I'm Jewish or had any connection to Jewish life. So let's talk about Russian Empire. And as we can see here in this map, one of the solutions, the Jews were always the problem. One of the solutions that the Katerina the Great, she was ruling Russian Empire in 1791, she said, okay, let's put all the Jews in a certain area. Let's put them in an area that we call today the Pale area. And this is Western Russia, Western Ukraine, a little bit on Poland. And the Jews, the majority of the Jews were there. So that's why we have a heavily populated areas right now also in Ukraine that the Jewish population is there. Now, as you can see, all the marks, X's, stars on the map, this is the different pogroms, the hate, crimes, violence that was towards the Jews back then. And those also made a lot of Jewish people to move to different countries, such as the United States, Israel, etc. That's why we have a lot of Ashkenazi Jews that not necessarily know where their roots are coming from, but many of their ancestors flee from the Pale area because of pogroms, hate, anti-Semitism, etc. Nobody was like pro-Jewish back then. Moving forward in history, we have the Soviet Union time. Now, Jews saw the Soviet Union and the communism as a solution. They thought, oh my God, this is a great movement, a movement that believes in freedom, justice, equality. This is awesome. We want to be part of this. And as we see the records, a lot of Jews were part of the leaders of the party and really pushed for those values. But one of the main problem was that there's no room for religion. And if you want to be part of the Communist Party, and my family members also were part of the Communist Party, you have to drop your Jewish identity. Now, also one of the solutions that the Soviets had to the problem is to say, let's consider Judaism as a nationality, and we're going to give them opportunity to be Jewish also in a certain area. So in Soviet Union, we had different nationalities. You can be Ukrainian, you can be Polish, you can be Slavic, and you can be Jewish. And this nationality was written, as you can see here, it says Ivrei on the third line in every identification passport or ID and stuff like this. So imagine that you're a Jewish person, you believe in your Jewish identity, and you want to go to university or get a governmental job. Flash news, like you cannot get to those positions because on the third line of your identity or if your ID card, it says that you're Jewish. So once again, the solution that the government presented was a little bit problematic. And what Jews basically did, they said, how can we basically cover this identity? How can we avoid this identity? Because we want to continue to develop, we want to continue to grow, we want to continue living in this country. And back then, under the Soviet Union, and especially during the Iron Curtain, you cannot leave the country. So imagine a situation that you want to have like some Jewish experience and you can't. And then if you do, you get beaten or investigated by the KGB and you cannot leave the country. So you have to embrace the suck and continue with all of that. So many people decided to basically assimilate, remarried, and choose their children identity. And that's how we have a huge population right now in Ukraine that they think that they're Jewish, or somebody told them that they're Jewish, they're not sure, and they don't have it on their identification. And it's also creates a lot of complexity right now with people that fleeing out of Ukraine to Israel. Another important, working.
In the early 1930s, millions of Ukraine's people died in a devastating famine. Known as the Holodomor, it is one of the most tragic chapters in Ukrainian history. When Ukraine became a part of the Soviet Union in 1922, it was the country's breadbasket, thanks to its fertile fields of wheat. In 1928, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin introduced collectivization, which was supposed to unite privately owned farms into state collective farms called kolkhoz. The Soviet leadership argued that collective farms would be more effective and produce a surplus, which would feed industrial workers. As many Ukrainian peasants were not willing to hand over their land to the state, their fields were confiscated. Many of them were sent into exile or abandoned their homes. In 1932, the government's quota on crops was raised significantly, and farmers were expected to harvest more than before. For many, it was a target that was impossible to meet. What grain they produced was confiscated with nothing left for them or their families. Farmers who hoarded their crops were often punished or executed. The exact number of people who died in the famine of 1932 and 1933 is still not known. Historians estimate that between 3 and 12 million people perished, most of them ethnic Ukrainians. For decades, the existence of the famine was denied by the Soviet Union. Historians in Russia and the West disagree as to whether the famine was man-made and if it was a deliberate attempt to eradicate Ukrainian independence. Since 2006, Ukraine and 15 other countries have recognized the Holodomor as a genocide against the Ukrainian people.
So there is trauma with the Ukrainian people against Russia, in a sense. Yes, it was the Soviet Union, everything was together, but the headquarters of the Soviet Union were in Moscow. So the Ukrainians been suffering for years from a ruler and also like to be under the Soviet Union. This is an existent trauma. People are terrified from this era. My ancestry, my grandparents been through this era, and it's still there. It's still in every family in Ukraine. They remember this. They remember this period of time. They don't want to go back there. And yes, Ukraine feeds many people around the world until today. And that's also another complexity that we have due to the war. The Holocaust. So during the Holocaust, half of the Ukrainian Jewish population was murdered by the Nazis and Ukrainian helpers, including the place that I'm coming from. That was a ghetto. And after the Holocaust, there were over 800,000 Jews remain in the Soviet Union after the war. To more happy phase, we're jumping into 1991 after the Soviet Union collapse, and Ukraine basically gets its independence. One of the effects of the independence, basically the gates were open, so people could move and leave the country and start their own life outside of USSR. And there was a massive immigration. 80% of the Jewish population left Ukraine, and we stayed with about 20% that we know of, because again, due to communism, a lot of people drop their Jewish identity and they're not necessarily aware of their ancestors and who they are. Over 200,000 Jews made the Aliyah to Israel, and the rest of them moved to the United States, Germany, and other countries. There are estimates between 200,000 300,000 Jews that live in right now in Ukraine. 10,000 of them are Holocaust survivors. And how it all relates to me, because I was born there. This is me as a kid, perfect Ukrainian child, didn't know anything about Israel, Judaism, etc. And this is where I'm coming from. So if you see maps of Ukraine and invasion, stuff like this, what happened right now, and during the war, my family is still here in a small town that's called Berezno. So this is where I'm located. Now, let's jump to current time. And I'm going to skip some parts of the history. And as Eddie shared, there was a crucial time in 2008, and I want to touch base a little bit about it. And I want to show you a short video, and I'm going to encourage all of you to watch it because it gives a very good recap, and you can find it on Netflix, if it's going to work.
Мамцю, я хочу, щоб ти... Мамцю, я тебе люблю, я тебе...
European Union leaders and Ukraine have failed to sign an historic free trade deal after a last-minute U-turn from Kiev.
Вы сказали, вроде бы как бы работали в этом направлении.
Мы тут, щоб до вас ще Україна, це дійсно Європа.
Когда уже начали собираться студенты, стало понятно, что это уже, что здесь что-то будет происходить.
Никакой агрессии, только мирная акция!
Хотели на корне сразу это все поломать, задавить, сразу, чтобы даже никому повадно не было. Но реакция оказалась обратная.
Ми не боїмося смерті заради свободи.
Майдан – це голос народу. Голос народу – це голос Божий. Слава Україні!
So basically, the Ukrainians, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was always this motion and this will to be part of the European Union. Myself as a child and my family were always talking and joking around like, one day our passports are going to be valued. One day we're going to be part of the European Union. And imagine that the kids that were born after the Soviet Union collapsed, they don't know what it's like to be under the Soviet Union. They know that Ukraine is an independent country that is capable to sustain, maintain, and be part of Europe. In 2014, we saw that the people of Ukraine said, we had enough. We don't want any more, puppet government of Putin. We want to step up and say, this is ours. We want to have a decent life. We want to continue and make sure that our children have a future. We don't want to be part of Russia. And again, it's not all the people. It was split in half almost between which side want to be with Europe, which side want to be in Russia, because Ukraine is a large country and there is different influences there. But 2014 literally was a pivot point in the Ukrainian history that said, okay, no more. The people want something and they deserve it. And basically this war is happening in the past 8 years. It's not something that's new for the Ukrainians to be under attack. And you see the region of Donbass that basically was taking over and was ruled by Russia. And in 2014, basically Putin came and took Crimea and nobody said anything. Nobody stopped him. And it was only the beginning. So once again, this is not new for the Ukrainians. Whenever I talk with my cousin and I talk with my family, they're like, we're used to it. Not at this capacity that we see it right now, but they had a feeling that maybe something is going to happen. And we saw Russian aggression, not only in Ukraine, but other countries as Syria, Georgia, and stuff like this. So it was a matter of time, maybe, that something like this will happen. But again, Ukrainian people fighting for their freedom, not for the first time, but they fighting for their freedom in the past 8 years. Now let's talk a little bit about the leadership. You all heard about the name Zelensky, the president. He's pretty young, he's 44, he's Jewish. He's the second Jewish leader in the world. So we have Bennett in Israel and we have Zelensky. And probably you all heard about it before. His job, he was a comedian and he was a lawyer, and now he's leading with a lot of courage. He's leading Ukraine in a phenomenal way that we all can learn about. Now, let's do a short recap of like the big events that happened in February. And again, we got to where we're at today. So Ukraine is always trying to push itself to be part of NATO, and suddenly the agreements real. So at the end of 2021, suddenly there was more movements. My internet is not stable. Okay, I hope it's fine right now. Suddenly there is like more movements of military forces, Russian military forces to the borders. And then Russia declared, we see if Ukraine is going to join NATO, we see it as a threat and we don't want it. So just for you to know. And then we have military in Belarus, the northern border of Ukraine. And mid-February, basically the US, the UK, Israel, other countries calling their citizens, calling everybody that belongs, embassies, all of this, go out of there. At this point, my parents are in Ukraine. At this point, my parents are back in Berezno. They've been there in the past 2 years. They're in Ukraine. And the map of the forces looked like that. This is mid-February. And as you can see, this is all the military. My family is here. So there was also threats on an attack from the north. And I'm freaking out at home, like at home in the US, and thinking to myself, how can I get my parents out of there? And they didn't want to go because nobody really believed that something like this is going to happen. They said, that's nothing. That's like, nothing's going to happen. Putin is not going to do it. Everything is going to be fine. And a week and a half before the war started, my dad, thank God, my dad got a job offer in Israel to run a project in Eilat, this other city. And that's the reason they left. And I don't know if to say Hagomel for that, but that was a matter of hours until something will happen and they came back. Now, I know I've been talking a lot and there is a lot of things. So The Economist, please play. If not, I'll play from a different source.
The world's attention is on the border between Russia and Ukraine, the site of the biggest military buildup in Europe since the Cold War. Russia has already annexed Crimea, part of Ukrainian territory, and plunged Donbass in Ukraine's southeast into a separate conflict.
Our allies and partners are ready to impose severe cost and significant harm on Russia and the Russian economy.
If Russia changes borders again by force, this will be a challenge to whole of European security.
But how did Ukraine become a flashpoint between Russia and the West? And why won't Russia leave Ukraine alone?
I don't think that Putin's finished with Ukraine. I don't think he will leave Ukraine unmolested.
Vladimir Putin disputes whether a border between Russia and Ukraine should exist.
Мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ.
He says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and has claimed that Ukraine isn't a state, but Ukraine is proud of its independence.
Ми молода країна з тисячолітньою історією.
Russia and Ukraine do have a shared ancestry. A union between Moscow and Kiev in the 17th century formed the base of the Russian Empire. Moscow considers Kiev the cradle of its civilization and its faith. Over the centuries since, the two countries have been intimately connected. Ukraine was a cornerstone of the Soviet Union until the bloc collapsed in 1991. At the time, Ukrainian independence went hand in hand with a new democratic Russia.
Ukraine in many ways set the example for Russia's own independence from the Soviet Union and the idea of Russia as a democratic republic.
But over the years, Moscow came to view Ukraine's independence as a strategic blow, as well as an emotional one. Today, around 13% of Ukrainians are ethnically Russian, and nearly a third speak Russian as a first language. But despite these ties, recent events are turning many Ukrainians against Russia.
It's a country which is responsible for 14,000 dead soldiers and civilians in the war in the east of Ukraine. It's a country that grabbed part of their territory. It's the country that poses constant threat.
75% of Ukrainians born since 1991 now see their future as in the EU, rather than with Russia. But a democratic Ukraine with ties to the West is unacceptable to Russia, mainly due to Ukraine's strategic significance. Ukraine is caught between two spheres of influence, the West and its defensive alliance NATO on one side, and Russia on the other. Vladimir Putin is determined to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit and keep it out of alliances with others.
Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO because he now sees it as antagonistic towards Russia. A fellow Slavic country, as he says, the same people as us, as a member of NATO, as part of the West, is an affront.
In 1991, NATO's borders in Central Europe only ran as far east as Germany. But as former Soviet bloc countries joined, the NATO alliance in Central Europe now runs, in some places, right up to the Russian border. Ukraine itself separates Russia from 4 NATO members. As far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine must never join NATO. And for Ukraine's first years of independence, that didn't seem likely. Ukraine was led by governments friendly to Moscow. But by Ukraine's 2004 presidential elections, it was clear Ukrainians had begun to look westwards, and Russia's influence had its limits. With the help of mass protests, Putin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych lost to pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. It became known as the Orange Revolution, and was evident that Russia was losing control of Ukraine.
Orange Revolution, it mattered because people rose against somebody he backed. It showed that people have agency.
Even when Yanukovych was voted in 5 years later, Putin still couldn't get his own way in Ukraine. Yanukovych continued to look both ways, to Europe and to Russia. When Ukraine was offered an association agreement with the EU, Putin countered with an economic offer of his own. Yanukovych eventually ditched the EU deal in favor of the economic pact with Russia. But many Ukrainians felt sold out, and peaceful protests in Kiev followed. Yanukovych's response was brutal, sparking further demonstrations and the downfall of his government. It was a slap in the face for Putin.
Video has emerged which appears to show President Yanukovych's entourage fleeing from his luxurious mansion outside Kiev.
Putin was furious. He was coming after similar protests in Russia. He had to make an example of Ukraine. He had to show that such events, revolutions, end badly and they end in civil war.
Putin's response was to annex the Ukrainian territory of Crimea.
Crimea, of course, means a lot to Russians. It has enormous symbolic importance. Of all the territories lost by Russia during the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the loss of Crimea was felt most acutely. His popularity rating shot up.
Putin went on to encourage uprisings of pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine, a conflict that's still going on. Putin's strategy has ensured that the EU and NATO keep Ukraine at arm's length, and stirring up conflict on Russia's borders could help with troubles at home. Putin's popularity is falling. Opposition to his regime is increasing, particularly among the young. In 2021, street protests erupted after opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned and then thrown in jail.
Putin needs a new source of legitimacy, and conflict with the West provides, in his eyes, that source of legitimacy.
Putin portrays himself as Russia's defender against a failing West. Western-style democracy can't be allowed to contrast favorably against his rule, least of all in neighboring Ukraine. A successful democracy next door might lead people to demand the same thing at home.
He is trying to protect his regime and compensate for insecurity and weakness internally by external aggression. And that's what rulers who've exploited their people, who've run corrupt and militaristic regimes have done over decades and centuries. Putin is definitely not the first leader to do that, and in that sense he's fallen into that old trap.
For as long as Putin's political woes continue, Russia's border with Ukraine is unlikely to be left in peace.
So that was a quick recap, basically, to take all the pieces of history and what we're having right now as a result of that. So right before everything started, a great nonprofit that I really, really encourage all of you to follow, and I will drop the link in the chat. They did like a survey, and it's before the war started, if they believe it's going to happen or not. As you can see, it's 50-50. So people didn't necessarily believe that it's going to happen. People were a little bit, and especially on the east side, they didn't think it's going to happen. 28% on the east side, it's already been under threat, and they're closer to Russia. They didn't think it's going to happen, compared to the west side, that more believe that a war is about to happen. And this is a picture from today. Again, everything is changing all the time. And this is where Russian military is at. As you can see, it's a lot in the north and the south, a lot of conflict going on in Kiev. Kiev is the capital city of Ukraine, and it's very essential to the Ukrainian people because it's got very, very long history. Also for the Jewish people, there's long history there. A lot of Jewish communities were growing around Kiev, and on top of that, we have Bavi Yar there. That's a huge massacre that was hit a few days ago, and that can erase a lot of Jewish history. So for us as the Jewish people, we need to be very, it's a war also, like it's more personal in a sense. I want to jump back again to our leader, or as many people call him, the modern Maccabee. And of course, the sentence that he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammo." And a lot of the speeches that he said he's giving, by the way, you can follow him on social media. Every morning he shares a speech with his people from the get-go, when everything's, and there is a translation in English. Don't worry, you don't have to learn Ukrainian, although I can teach you, but everything is in English as well. And from the get-go, he said, "I'm going to be transparent with my people. I'm going to share everything that's happening. I'm here with you. We're all in this together." And one of the things I really like that he said, life is going to defeat death, and light will win over darkness. And he constantly, and this is from one of the interviews that he gave at ABC, he said, everyone thinks that we're far away from, that Ukraine is far away from America, and the war is like in a different zone, in a different place. But we need to understand that Ukraine is not only fighting for their land, their freedom, their ability to have life in a country, a democratic country. They are fighting for our freedom as well, because Putin is not going to stop there. If he's going to take over Ukraine. So right now, we're literally fighting democracy against autocracy. It's a clash between two words. And I don't think that Putin really thought that this is going to be the situation that he's at right now. He thought that he will go in, it's going to be quick, he's going to take over, and that's it. But he met the Ukrainian people that are very, very resistant. And he met Ukrainian people that do want to have a decent life, a future, and freedom to live in a free country, because they've been through so much in history, and they deserve to have their own country. They are a democratic country. So I think this type of leadership really showed a little bit about the Ukrainian people. And I want to share with you a message. Please work. If not, I have a different source. There you go.
Hello, my name is Maxim. I'm Anna's cousin, and I currently stay at our hometown of Berezne, which is in the northwestern part of the country. It is relatively quieter here than in the remainder of the territory, but still we live under the wartime conditions. There is a curfew here. There are shortages of things that can be bought at the supermarkets here. Every now and then we need to go to the bombing shelters because of the airstrike alerts, and so on and so forth. As I said, in the remainder of the territory, it is even worse. For instance, my My close people that have stayed in Kiev, they are under more dire circumstances. They practically live in the bombing shelters, and the shortage of goods is worse than here. And also there are a couple of places, I think up to 10 cities in the territory of Ukraine up to this point, where there is a humanitarian catastrophe, literally, because of the absence of green corridors, because of the shortage of such simple things as water, and the situation is very dire there. It also has been quite difficult psychologically, because the things that are happening now have been massive. First of all, we have been feeling fear because of the surprise factor and because of the scope of the invasion. After that, we felt much grief because of the losses we were bearing and keep bearing against the backdrop of what's happening, and that really is a huge amount of grief. And after that, we felt and keep feeling much hope, because everybody thought we would fall quicker, but we keep fighting. But at the same time, we start feeling worn out because of the protraction of things. Because even though we may be more successful in fighting than we thought we would be, we still fail to see the light at the end of the corridor, at the end of the tunnel. And this is why things are not very easy here, to put it mildly.
So Ukrainians are fighting, or it's a unity for victory, basically. Everybody taking part, an active part in the war. A little bit from the city that I'm coming from Berezno, that it's not under an attack right now, but the entire city is pulled together in order to support the soldiers. If it's to make food, to deliver hot beverages, to be there to support them and to be on the checkpoints. And the question is for how long they can keep this energy up, because it's over 2 weeks right now that they're in a fight, in a war, they're isolated. The humanitarian corridor is not necessarily working because basically Russia bombing them, and there is a shortage of food. And think about the people that don't have the ability to travel, to move, because they're homebound. And Ukraine is not prepared for a war. The colors of the flag, by the way, the blue symbolize the peace in the sky, peace in the sky, because they coming for peace, and the yellow symbolize the land and the wheat basically that grows in Ukraine. So they're not used to be in this situation. They don't have bomb shelters. Yes, I'm also from Israel, and in Israel, every house has a bomb shelter because this is the reality that we live in. In Ukraine, they don't have this. They don't have where to run, so they're going like underground, or it's a storage unit basically underground that they can hide there. But there's no good air. There's no heating system there. So they're basically trapped. And if a bomb will fall in the house, they don't have the ability to get out of there if something like this will happen. And we see a shift with Putin's strategy, basically, that instead of, targeting military, he basically targets everything. Children, hospitals, schools, whatever. Civilian cities are being bombed, destroyed to the ground. It just puts us back in history, like 80 years ago, 70 years ago, with everything happening in Europe, and we reliving this reality again. He doesn't care who, where, and what, just to bomb and destroy. And nobody exactly knows what's going to happen next. Nobody exactly knows how it's going to affect. And basically, there is also a very difficult time to communicate with Russia, because Russia is shut down as well. Like, they don't have internet, they don't have access to other information. And right now, 58% of the Russian population supports what's happening in Ukraine. This is a map of the refugees, because the Ukrainians are moving out. So right now, if you're a male between the ages 18 to 60, you cannot leave the country. And the majority of the people that fleeing Ukraine right now are women and children. And of course, I'm sure you all saw the video of the kid walking, he crossed the border by himself. And that's also put us in bigger humanitarian problem after, and a refugee problem, because we don't know for how long we're going to keep fighting. We have no idea what's going to happen next week. We have no idea what's going to happen in the next hour. And we might stepping into a huge refugee problem that we need to deal with. And again, the majority of the people are women and children. And in my, in my head, I'm like thinking to the future. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I hope that nobody's taking advantage of those women or stuff like this, because that's also can be the reality. So there's a lot of unknown. And now it's the time to also like think how we as people and the power of peoplehood that I'm so happy to share this words, because I feel like us as a Jewish community, we step out in a moment of crisis, especially Jewish federations, that this is our bread and butter basically of our activity and what we do, and we have the ability to support and help. And I don't know if you guys saw this video, if it's gonna work. If not, we'll play it from a different source. Work? No. Let's play it from a different source. There you go.
So here's a update on the situation of invasion in Ukraine. Right behind me you can see the building that was damaged by a missile that was shot at Kiev this morning.
Самое сложное — это как объяснить трехлетней дочери, что началась война.
I decided to give some water to shelter. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time, as there is another alarm in Kiev, and right now I'm going to get my mother and take her to the shelter.
Помахи рукой. Помахай.
Ну, нам страшно, да. Вот. Я очень благодарен всем еврейским организациям Украины, мира.
So basically, whenever you give to Federation, and right now we created an emergency fund to support other organizations out there that are boots on the ground, basically to operate this crisis. So the Jewish Federation of North America created this fund, and basically the immediate and the short-term need is $20 million. I'm super happy that we raised a lot of money. We're very close. We like around the $19 million, very close to 20. And it will go immediately to the organizations that you see right now. And of course, there's other organizations that are operated on the ground. And I will drop another link with you with other organizations that are there. And of course, you can donate to the fund, and you have the link already in the chat. So again, this is the power of peoplehood. We have 200,000 Jews right now in Ukraine, or some of them already moved to different countries and also to Israel. This is not something that's going to end up in a week. There's not something that's going to end up in a month. It's something that it's a crisis that it's going to be with us for a while. And it's not going to impact only Ukraine and Russia and Europe and Israel. It's going to impact the entire world, because we're going to see problems with, prices are going to increase, economical deficit, things are going to be different. And again, just remember, the Ukrainian people are not fighting the fight only for themselves. They're fighting the fight also for us, for freedom, for values, democratic values, for democracy in general. We cannot allow democracy not to stand, not to be there. We cannot allow a different country to basically take over another democratic countries. We've been there in history. We cannot allow it to happen again. So, there's a lot to say, a lot to do, a lot of things happening, a lot of moving parts. And one of the things I want to share with you as a Ukrainian, as a Jewish leader, as somebody that has family right now in Ukraine and also a little bit in Russia, that keep Ukraine in your minds, in your hearts, in your actions, and everything that you do on a daily basis. Because One of my biggest fears that something will pop on the news tomorrow. I don't know, Elon Musk will like land on Mars or something like this. And then suddenly nobody will go and talk about Ukraine. And we cannot allow this to happen. Like, you see me right now, I'm your Ukrainian friend. I'm your Ukrainian face. Whenever you hear something about Ukraine, think about me.